I sat quietly at my 20th birthday party and transferred my entire multi-million-dollar inheritance from my grandparents into an ironclad blind trust. I left a dummy corporation in its place just as a precaution. 15 years later, at my parents' lavish anniversary gala, my mother handed me a $15,000 catering bill bragging that they had just sold my useless dirt patch to fund my younger sister's white husband and his new commercial real estate firm. She had absolutely no idea that the deed they forged was a worthless piece of paper, and the man they sold it to was about to ruin their lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members to protect your peace. The crystal chandeliers of the Buckhead Country Club cast a warm golden glow over the grand ballroom, but the atmosphere at our designated family table was freezing cold. We were celebrating my parents, Vivian and Calvin, and their 40th wedding anniversary. To the outside world, my parents were the pinnacle of Black excellence in Atlanta. My father owned a highly profitable chain of luxury car dealerships, and my mother was a prominent socialite who sat on the board of every major charity and arts foundation in the city. They wore their wealth like armor, projecting an image of flawless success and untouchable grace. But behind closed doors, they were obsessed with status and driven by a desperate need to maintain appearances at any cost. Across from me sat my younger sister Jasmine and her husband Connor. Jasmine was 32 years old and had always been the undeniable golden child of the family. Tonight she was dripping in designer labels, wearing a custom silk gown that probably cost more than my first car. She played the role of a highly successful luxury lifestyle influencer, posting perfectly curated photos of her extravagant vacations and high-end shopping sprees. In reality, she was drowning in hidden credit card debt and constantly draining my parents' bank accounts to maintain her aesthetic. She had never worked a traditional job a day in her life, but my parents treated her like a visionary entrepreneur. Connor was her smooth-talking white husband who played golf with the right local politicians and investors, but never seemed to actually close a real commercial real estate deal on his own. He had married into our family and immediately started acting like he was the heir to my parents' empire. He wore a velvet tuxedo jacket and kept swirling his expensive bourbon, looking around the room as if he owned the entire building. And then there was me. I am Iman, 35 years old, single, and entirely focused on my career, because I wore tailored suits instead of couture gowns and preferred quiet evenings over lavish red carpet events. My family treated me like a boring, glorified bean counter. I was the family workhorse, the reliable one they could ignore until they needed someone to handle the unglamorous logistics of their lives. My grandparents had seen through the superficiality of my parents, which is why they left their most valuable asset directly to me. It was a massive plot of undeveloped land in a rapidly gentrifying commercial district. My grandparents had purchased that land decades ago when it was nearly impossible for Black families to buy property in that specific area. It was sacred to me, a symbol of their resilience and hard work. My parents had always hated that I refused to sell it to fund their various vanity projects. The clinking of heavy silver forks against fine bone china filled the room as the catering staff cleared the appetizer plates. My mother stood up and tapped her crystal champagne flute with a perfectly manicured fingernail. The chatter at our private table and the surrounding VIP tables died down. I expected her to offer a heartfelt toast about 40 years of marriage or thank the guests for attending. Instead, she reached into her beaded designer clutch and pulled out a heavy leather folder. She did not look at my father. She looked directly at me. She walked over and dropped the folder directly onto my dinner plate with a loud thud that made the crystal water glasses rattle. I looked down at the itemized receipt tucked inside. It was the catering bill for the entire gala, totaling just over $15,000. The bill covered the imported caviar, the top-shelf liquor, and the 5-tier fondant cake sitting across the room. I looked up at my mother, keeping my face completely neutral. I asked her why she was handing me the bill for a party she and my father had insisted on throwing for themselves. My mother offered a tight, practiced smile that completely failed to reach her eyes. She placed her hands on the table and leaned in close so her words carried absolute authority. Since we just sold that useless dirt patch, your grandparents left you to fund Connor's new commercial real estate firm, she said, her voice ringing with deep satisfaction. Paying for tonight is the least you can do to contribute to this family's legacy, Iman. The entire table fell dead silent. My cousins and aunts sitting nearby stopped chewing and turned their heads to watch the drama unfold. I glanced over at Connor, who was already leaning back in his chair with a smug, self-satisfied grin plastered across his face. He eagerly pulled out his phone and leaned over to show his country club friends sitting at the adjacent table a banking screenshot. He practically shouted, so the whole room could hear, that he had secured a $1.5 million non-refundable deposit yesterday afternoon from a major buyer. He laughed loudly and bragged about how easy it was to bypass my stubborn refusal to build wealth, claiming I was just squatting on prime commercial zoning and holding the family back from generational prosperity. Jasmine chimed in, immediately flipping her expensive hair over her shoulder and adjusting her diamond necklace. She told me I should be thanking them on my hands and knees, because now the family name would be attached to a major downtown development project, instead of letting wild grass and weeds grow over a property I clearly did not know how to manage. She sneered and said it was time I stopped being so selfish and actually supported my brother-in-law's business ventures, since he was the only one making real power moves in the corporate world. I did not cry. I did not yell or throw a drink or cause a public scene. I had spent my entire adult life watching them prioritize appearances over actual integrity, and I knew exactly how to handle their arrogance. I calmly reached into my suit jacket purse and pulled out my heavy metal corporate credit card. I signaled the head waiter over and handed him the card, instructing him to clear the entire balance for the room and add a generous 20% gratuity. My mother looked momentarily triumphant. She exchanged a knowing, gleeful glance with Jasmine and Calvin as if they had successfully bullied me into submission one more time. They thought handing over the card was my way of admitting defeat, my way of accepting my place as the subordinate daughter who would just swallow their disrespect to keep the peace. But I was not submitting. I was setting the stage for their absolute destruction. Once the waiter walked away with the leather folder, I turned my attention entirely to Connor. I kept my posture relaxed and my voice perfectly level, stripped of any anger or panic. I asked him a very simple question. I asked him which specific parcel of land he thought he had sold to this mysterious buyer. Connor chuckled, shaking his head condescendingly, as if I were a slow child asking a foolish question. He rattled off the exact geographical coordinates, the parcel identification numbers, and the street address of my grandparents' historic estate. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and boasted about how he found a high-profile buyer willing to pay millions above market value because the commercial zoning permits were already cleared and ready for high-rise construction. He smirked and asked me if I needed him to draw a diagram to explain how real estate transactions worked, since I was just a mid-level accounting clerk who only dealt with boring spreadsheets all day. I smiled back at him. It was a cold, calculated smile that instantly made the atmosphere at the table drop 10 degrees. My demeanor shifted entirely from the passive, obedient daughter to the federal investigator I actually was. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that I did not need him to explain a single thing to me about real estate law or financial transactions, because I was not a mid-level accounting clerk. I revealed to the entire table what I actually did for a living, keeping my voice sharp and loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear every single syllable. I am a senior forensic accountant, I said, watching the color slowly begin to drain from Connor's face, and I specialize in prosecuting commercial real estate compliance fraud for the federal government. The waiter returned at that exact moment and placed the printed credit card receipt in front of me. I picked up a heavy silver pen, signed my name with a smooth, deliberate flourish, and pushed the leather folder back across the table toward my mother. Then I shifted my gaze back to Connor, who had suddenly stopped smiling entirely. His hand tightened around his bourbon glass, and his breathing hitched. "That is fascinating, Connor," I said, my voice slicing through the soft classical music playing in the background of the ballroom, "because the title you forged and sold yesterday afternoon expired 15 years ago." Connor's smug smile melted off his face so fast it almost looked painful. He let out a sharp, forced laugh, shaking his head as he looked around the table for support from his wealthy country club friends. He told me I was bluffing, his voice pitching up an octave in sudden panic. He insisted he had pulled the deed himself, filed the transfer, and had the county clerk approve it. He pointed a shaking finger at me and said, I could not just stand there making up fairy tales because I was jealous of their massive success. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not back down. I kept my eyes locked on him while I took a slow sip of my ice water. I told him I was not bluffing. I added that if he was actually half the commercial real estate mogul, he pretended to be in front of his elite friends. He would know how to read a basic corporate tax filing before claiming a multi-million-dollar property as his own. For 15 years, I had sat at family dinners swallowing their insults and letting them call me a boring pencil pusher. For 15 years, I had watched them parade around Atlanta, pretending their wealth was built on hard work instead of deceit. I had waited patiently for the day their arrogance would finally outgrow their intelligence, and tonight was that day. I shifted my gaze away from him and looked directly at my father. Calvin sat frozen in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were turning gray. I told him this was about him, and that it had always been about him. I asked him if he really thought I was asleep that night 15 years ago on the eve of my 20th birthday. My mother. Vivian let out a loud gasp, her hand flying to her chest. She ordered me to keep my voice down and stop embarrassing the family, but I refused to let her interrupt me. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the pristine white tablecloth. I told my father I was sitting on the stairs in the dark, while he was pacing the kitchen floor on his phone. I recounted how I heard every single word he said to his bookie. I heard him crying and begging for more time. I heard him promise those dangerous men that he was going to use my grandparents' historic land to secure a massive loan to cover his secret gambling debts. My father looked like all the air had been violently knocked out of his lungs. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. The surrounding guests were completely silent now, hanging on my every word. I continued my explanation with cold precision. I told them that the very next morning, while my parents were busy planning another ridiculous socialite gala to show off their fake wealth, I walked straight into a federal wealth management firm downtown. I took the estate my grandparents entrusted to me, and I legally transferred the entire thing into an ironclad blind trust. I locked it away behind miles of federal red tape where none of them could ever touch a single blade of grass. Jasmine was staring at me, her jaw practically on the floor. Her designer facade was slipping, revealing the terrified little girl underneath. Connor interrupted me, his hands physically shaking now as he patted down his velvet tuxedo jacket. He argued that he saw the deed with his own eyes. He claimed my name was printed clearly on the limited liability company, and that it was fully registered with the state. I smiled, but there was no warmth in my expression. I told Connor that I left a dummy corporation in its place. I explained that it was a legally worthless shell company on paper, just sitting there like a trap, waiting to see if my own family would ever be greedy enough to try and steal from me. I told him it took 15 years, but he and my sister finally took the bait. Connor shouted that I was lying, drawing even more stares from the surrounding ballroom tables. He frantically yanked his phone out of his pocket. His fingers were trembling so badly he dropped the device onto his dinner plate before snatching it back up. He scrambled to open the county property records application, desperate to prove me wrong in front of his wealthy peers, who were now watching him with sheer, unadulterated horror. He shoved the glowing screen toward my face, hissing that the transfer went through and the company was active. I did not even blink. I reached out and gently tapped my manicured fingernail against the bottom corner of his phone screen. I told him to look closer at the corporate identification number. I told him to look at the tax ID. I explained with the authority of a federal investigator that he was looking at a defunct entity. I broke it down for him, slowly stating that the state dissolved that shell company a decade ago for zero activity. Any contract signed under that corporate name was completely null and void. The deed he filed was nothing more than a piece of decorative paper. I looked him dead in the eye and told him he had forged my signature to sell a ghost. The silence in our section of the ballroom was absolute. The country club elites who had been cheering for Connor just moments ago were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, physically backing away from our table to distance themselves from the impending fallout. Connor stared at the screen. His eyes darted back and forth, reading the fine print he had been too arrogant and eager to check before closing his fraudulent deal. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving him looking sickly and pale. The phone slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. He stumbled backward, his chair scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. He turned slowly to my sister, his voice cracking with absolute terror. He whispered her name and told her they needed to wire the $1.5 million deposit back to the buyer, right this second. He pleaded with her, saying they had to reverse the transaction before the buyer realized the title was fake. Jasmine let out a piercing, high-pitched shriek that shattered whatever dignity our family had left in that elegant room. Her flawless influencer persona completely disintegrated. She grabbed her expensive hair, digging her acrylic nails into her scalp. She wailed loudly, tears streaming down her face and ruining her designer makeup. She cried out that she could not return the money because it was already gone. Connor lost all his polished composure. He screamed at her, asking what she meant by the money being gone. He grabbed her by the shoulders, ignoring the shocked gasps from the guests around us. He demanded to know where the funds went since they just received the wire transfer yesterday afternoon. Jasmine was sobbing hysterically now, her chest heaving as she tried to defend her actions. She cried out that she needed the money for her personal brand. She yelled that she had to keep up the aesthetic because her social media followers were starting to notice they were only renting their lifestyle. She confessed right there in front of everyone that she took $300,000 of the stolen deposit yesterday morning. She admitted to putting a non-refundable down payment on a luxury penthouse condo in Midtown Atlanta and buying a brand new luxury SUV in pure cash. She sobbed that she had to do it to look like they were winning in life. Connor staggered back away from her, looking like he was going to be physically sick right there on the ballroom floor. He choked out his words, running his trembling hands over his face in total disbelief. He repeated over and over that she spent the buyer's money without even securing the real land. He turned to me, his eyes wide with sheer panic. He begged me to fix the situation and sign over the real trust immediately. He cried that if I did not help him, the buyer would report him, and he was going to be arrested for federal wire fraud and sent to federal prison for a very long time. Watching him beg for my help after he had spent the entire evening humiliating me was the sweetest vindication I had ever experienced. I sat back in my chair, completely unfazed by their emotional meltdown. I picked up my water glass and took another slow, deliberate sip. I told Connor I was not fixing anything. I reminded him that he dug this grave all by himself and now he was going to lie in it. My father finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. Calvin was a man who spent his entire life bullying car salesmen and intimidating dealership managers into submission. He was used to barking orders and having people scramble to obey. He lunged across the pristine white tablecloth, knocking over a crystal wine glass. Red wine spilled across the linen like blood, but he did not even notice. He grabbed my forearm, his heavy fingers digging painfully into the fabric of my tailored suit jacket. He lowered his voice into a dangerous, gravelly tone, commanding me to stop playing games. He told me to call my trust attorneys right this second and authorize an emergency transfer. He demanded I pull the estate out of the blind trust and sign the real deed over to Connor immediately so they could retroactively legitimize the sale. He said I was going to fix this mess right now before the federal authorities got involved and destroyed the family name. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. I did not shrink away like I would have when I was a teenager. I aggressively yanked my arm out of his grasp with so much force that he stumbled forward, catching himself on the edge of the table. I took a step back, creating a physical boundary between us. I told him he had lost his mind if he thought he could put his hands on me and order me to cover up a felony. I snapped back that I was done being treated like a disposable automated teller machine for this family. I reminded him of all the times I had quietly cleaned up their financial disasters over the past 10 years. I reminded him how I paid off the silent partners when his dealership expanded too fast. I reminded him how I quietly covered the taxes when my mother mismanaged her charity funds. I told him I had spent my entire adult life acting as their financial safety net while they treated me like an unwanted burden. I said those days were officially over, and I was not signing away my grandparents' legacy to save a thief. Connor was hyperventilating now. He was pacing a tight circle behind his chair, violently tugging at his velvet collar as if it were choking him. He kept muttering about the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He knew exactly what the penalties were for wire fraud across state lines. Jasmine was absolutely useless in the crisis. She sat slumped in her chair, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. Her flawless makeup was completely ruined. Black mascara running down her cheeks as the reality of losing her brand new luxury car and her penthouse condo finally set in. Seeing that brute force and intimidation were not going to work on me, my mother decided to change her tactics. Vivian was a master manipulator who knew exactly how to twist a situation to make herself the victim. She rushed around the table and slid into the empty chair next to me. She reached out and tried to grab my hands, but I folded my arms tightly across my chest, refusing to let her touch me. She dropped her voice into an urgent, pleading whisper, the exact same tone she used to solicit major donations at her high society galas. She attempted to guilt-trip me by weaponizing our culture and our heritage. She looked up at me with wide, desperate eyes, telling me that we are a prominent Black family in Atlanta and we have a generational legacy to uphold. She hissed that there is a whole world out there just waiting for successful Black folks to stumble and fail. She told me I could not let a federal fraud scandal attach itself to our family name because the media would completely destroy everything she and my father had spent 40 years building. She begged me to think about our community standing. She said I had a duty to protect our image of excellence against a society that wanted to see us locked up and ruined. She told me I had to sacrifice the land for the greater good of the family. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing but profound disgust. I let out a short, cold laugh that made her flinch and pull back. I leaned down so we were face to face, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper that cut straight through her manipulative tears. I told her she had a lot of nerve trying to bring up our culture and our image right now. I stared directly into her eyes, delivering a counter that shattered her entire argument. I told her she forgot all about my Blackness, my image and my humanity, the second she stood by and watched her spoiled daughter let a white man forge my signature to steal my inheritance. I told her she was perfectly fine, throwing her own Black daughter to the wolves and letting me be robbed blind as long as it paid for her country club membership and kept up Jasmine's fake social media lifestyle. I said she did not care about Black excellence, she only cared about her own selfish greed. I told her she had sold her soul a long time ago, and I was not going to let her use my skin color as a shield to protect a criminal. My mother opened her mouth to argue, but the words died instantly in her throat. She froze, staring over my shoulder with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom had just swung open. The string quartet was still playing a soft classical melody in the corner, but all the oxygen seemed to completely vanish from our table. A tall, imposing man in a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit strode into the room. He was holding a highly expensive bottle of vintage champagne in one hand and walking with the unmistakable confidence of a man who owned everything he touched. It was Mr. Pierce, the notoriously ruthless Atlanta developer who had just wired $1.5 million to buy the Phantom land. He had a wide, victorious smile on his face, completely unaware that the deal of the century he thought he'd just closed was actually a massive federal crime. He was heading straight for our table, ready to celebrate his successful acquisition. Mr. Pierce moved across the ballroom floor with the kind of predatory grace that only comes from possessing more money than God. He was a towering figure in Atlanta real estate, an older white man with sharp features and tailored suits who had built his empire by crushing anyone who got in his way. He held that expensive bottle of vintage champagne in one hand and a set of crystal glasses in the other. I was smiling broadly, ready to toast to what he thought was a historic acquisition for his company. The moment my parents saw him approaching our table, their entire demeanor shifted with terrifying speed. It was a flawless instant code switch that I had watched them perform 1,000 times before. The vicious, desperate people who had just been screaming at me completely vanished. In the blink of an eye, my mother Vivian smoothed down her designer gown and arranged her features into the warm, elegant smile she used for magazine covers and charity galas. She nudged my sister Jasmine under the table, hissing at her to wipe her ruined mascara and sit up straight. My father, Calvin, was even faster. The panic completely drained from his face, replaced by the polished, charming mask of a successful luxury car dealer. He stood up straight, buttoning his tuxedo jacket, but before he stepped forward to greet our guest, he leaned down right next to my ear. He placed his heavy hand on my shoulder and squeezed the joint so hard I could feel my bones grinding together. His voice was a barely audible rasp meant only for me. He told me to wipe the look off my face and smile. He whispered that I was going to play along with this deal, or he would personally make sure I never worked in this city again. He told me I was going to nod my head and be the quiet, obedient daughter, because he was not about to let me humiliate our proud black family in front of a white billionaire. I did not pull away this time. I just turned my head slightly and looked into his desperate, angry eyes. I let him see the absolute void of emotion in my own. I told him he was standing on the tracks and the train was already here. Connor was practically vibrating with terror. His velvet tuxedo jacket was visibly damp with sweat beneath his arms. He knew exactly who Mr. Pierce was, and he knew what kind of power the man wielded in the corporate world. Connor scrambled out of his chair, nearly tripping over his own expensive leather shoes. He rushed forward to intercept the developer before Pierce could get too close to our side of the table. Connor threw on his best country club voice, loud and overly friendly, trying desperately to project the image of a seasoned real estate broker in control of his domain. He greeted Pierce with exaggerated enthusiasm, holding out both of his trembling hands. He told Pierce it was an absolute honor to see him tonight, and suggested they take the champagne back to the private VIP lounge to discuss the final closing details away from the noise of the main ballroom. Connor was babbling, his words running together as he tried to physically block Pierce's view of me and the rest of the table. He laughed nervously, making some terrible joke about how family parties were always too chaotic for serious business talk. Mr. Pierce did not laugh. He did not smile. He did not even reach out to shake Connor's eagerly extended hand. Pierce stopped walking and looked at my brother-in-law with a cold, flat expression that bordered on absolute disgust. He looked at Connor the way a person might look at a piece of trash they had accidentally stepped on. Pierce did not say a single word to him. He simply adjusted his grip on the champagne bottle and stepped right around Connor, completely ignoring his existence. Connor stood there, frozen, his hands still hovering in the empty air, his face burning with public humiliation. The few guests at nearby tables who were watching the interaction began to whisper among themselves. In the elite social circles of Atlanta, being publicly ignored by a titan like Pierce was the ultimate death knell for a career. Pierce closed the distance to our table. My mother immediately stepped forward, extending her hand gracefully. She introduced herself using her most melodic high society voice, welcoming him to their anniversary gala and telling him how thrilled they were to merge their family legacy with his incredible vision for the city. She expected him to kiss her hand or offer some polite flattery about her beautiful event. Pierce completely ignored my mother too. He walked right past her outstretched hand, leaving her standing awkwardly in her expensive gown. He bypassed my father, who was already opening his mouth to offer a charming greeting. Pierce walked straight to my side of the table. The air in the room felt incredibly thin. My family watched in total stunned silence as this notoriously ruthless billionaire came to a respectful halt right in front of my chair. The aggressive, predatory look completely left his face. He set the bottle of champagne down on the white linen cloth and stood up straight, offering me a polite, formal nod. He extended his right hand toward me. His voice was warm and filled with genuine professional respect when he spoke. He said it was an absolute pleasure to see me outside of the federal building. He called me director. My mother let out a small, choked gasp. My father stared at Pierce and then at me, his eyes wide with sheer disbelief. Jasmine, who was still dabbing at her ruined makeup, completely froze, her mouth hanging open. Connor had slowly turned around from where he had been rejected, and he looked like he was about to pass out on the floral carpet. I stood up from my chair, taking my time. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit, looking Pierce in the eye. I reached out and shook his hand with a firm, confident grip. I told him it was a surprise to see him at a social event, but that Atlanta was a surprisingly small city when it came to real estate. Pierce chuckled warmly, clearly oblivious to the absolute terror radiating from the people standing around me. He told me he was here to celebrate a massive acquisition for his firm. He gestured casually toward Connor, who was now visibly swaying on his feet. Pierce explained that he had just secured the historic parcel of land in the downtown commercial district, the one his firm had been trying to acquire for years. He told me he wanted to bring a bottle of the best champagne the club had to offer to toast the young broker who finally made it happen. Jasmine, desperate to reassert her dominance and terrified of the power dynamic shifting away from her husband, stepped forward. She tried to force a laugh, waving her hand dismissively at me. She told Mr. Pierce that there must be some sort of mistake. She used her sweet, condescending influencer voice to explain that I was just her older sister who worked a boring accounting job. She told Pierce he really should not bother talking to me because I was just a paper pusher who did not understand high-level corporate business. She tried to step between us, reaching out to touch Pierce's arm and steer him back toward Connor. Pierce turned his head slowly and looked at Jasmine. The warmth completely vanished from his eyes. He gave her a look so freezing and intensely dismissive that Jasmine instantly snatched her hand back and shrank away from him. He did not say a word to her, but the message was incredibly clear. She was completely out of her depth. Pierce turned his attention back to me, shaking his head slightly, as if apologizing for my sister's profound ignorance. He asked me what I was doing at a country club gala, since he knew my schedule at the federal agency was notoriously demanding. He mentioned the last time we spoke in my downtown office when my team was auditing his firm's compliance records for a massive urban development project. I watched the realization hit my parents like a physical blow. The daughter they had mocked and belittled for being a boring bean counter, the daughter they had excluded from their conversations about wealth and power, was the very person who held the regulatory authority over the most powerful developers in the state. I was not just a clerk, I was the gatekeeper. I picked up my leather briefcase from the floor beside my chair and set it flat on the dining table. The snap of the metal latches echoed loudly in the tense silence of our section. I opened the lid and pulled out a thick certified manila envelope. I looked at Pierce, my expression shifting back to strict professional neutrality. I told him that I was actually here on family business, but it appeared our professional worlds were colliding tonight. I handed the certified copy of the actual trust documents directly to him. The paper was thick, bearing the official federal seal and the active tax identification numbers of the blind trust that held my grandparents' estate. I looked him straight in the eye and kept my voice perfectly steady. My words cut through the remaining gala music like a knife. I told Mr. Pierce that the man pouring his champagne had just sold him a forged title. I told him that my brother-in-law had committed federal wire fraud and that his $1.5 million deposit was already gone. The polite smile vanished from Mr. Pierce's face so fast it was like a light bulb shattering in the dark. He did not yell. He did not cause a chaotic scene. Men with his level of wealth and power do not need to raise their voices to destroy you. He simply reached out and took the certified federal documents from my hands. He adjusted his suit jacket and spent a long, agonizing minute reading over the active tax identification numbers and the official federal seals proving that my blind trust was the only legal owner of that land. He slowly lowered the papers and turned his attention to my brother-in-law. Connor looked like a man standing on the gallows waiting for the floor to drop. Mr. Pierce stepped closer to him, invading his personal space. His voice dropped into a lethal corporate growl. He told Connor that he had exactly until 9 o'clock on Monday morning to wire every single cent of that $1.5 million deposit back into his escrow account. He stated with absolute freezing certainty that if the funds were not cleared and sitting in his bank by 1 minute past 9, he was going to make a direct phone call to his personal contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He promised Connor that he would personally ensure he spent the rest of his pathetic life rotting in a federal prison for wire fraud. Mr. Pierce did not wait for an apology. He did not wait for an explanation. He turned on his heel and walked straight out of the Buckhead Country Club, leaving his expensive bottle of vintage champagne sitting untouched on our table. The second, the heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind him. The illusion of our perfect high society family completely imploded. My mother Vivian turned on me with a feral look in her eyes. Her manicured hands were shaking with rage as she slammed her fists onto the table. She hissed at me, demanding to know how I could be so cruel and heartless. She accused me of deliberately trying to destroy the family name and ruining my sister's marriage just because I was bitter and jealous of their success. My father Calvin joined in, his face dark with fury. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest and growled that I had just signed a death warrant for his luxury car dealerships because the scandal would ruin his credit with every major bank in Atlanta. I sat there listening to them blame me for the crimes they had committed. I did not raise my voice. I simply reminded them that I was not the one who forged a federal document and stole over $1 million. Connor was pacing the floor, gripping the sides of his head. The reality of federal prison was crashing down on him, and self-preservation kicked in. Cornered and terrified, he turned around and threw his own wife completely under the bus. He pointed at Jasmine and screamed at the top of his lungs that the forgery was entirely her idea. He yelled that he never wanted to do it, but Jasmine had practically begged him to forge my signature because she was drowning in over $100,000 of hidden credit card debt. He exposed to our parents and everyone listening that Jasmine's entire luxury influencer lifestyle was a complete scam and that she had threatened to leave him if he did not find a way to fund her shopping addiction. Jasmine went absolutely ballistic. The perfectly poised golden child shattered right in front of my eyes. She lunged forward, pointing her acrylic nails inches from Connor's face, screaming that he was a pathetic coward who could not even provide for his own wife. But she did not stop there. Desperate to deflect the blame, she turned her rage toward our parents. She shrieked that Vivian and Calvin had no right to look at her with such disgust because they knew exactly what she and Connor were planning. My jaw tightened as Jasmine exposed the deepest, ugliest secret of our family dynamic. She yelled that our parents gave them the green light to forge the deed because Calvin was secretly drowning in debt from his luxury car dealerships, and Vivian was terrified of losing her spot on the country club charity board. Jasmine screamed that they all agreed to steal my grandparents' legacy because they needed the prestige and the cash to maintain their flawless image of black excellence. They had all sat around a table and decided that I was expendable. The truth hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Vivian realized the damage was permanent. Her wealthy friends at the neighboring tables had heard every single word of Jasmine's confession. The socialite facade she had spent 40 years building was dead. Vivian completely broke down. She dropped to her knees right there on the floral carpet, ruining her expensive designer gown. She crawled toward my chair, sobbing hysterically with black mascara running down her cheeks. She grabbed my hands, her fingers digging into my skin. She wept and begged me to use the real trust fund to pay Mr. Pierce back. She pleaded with me to wire the $1.5 million on Monday morning to save them. She cried out that Connor was my brother-in-law, and that if he went to federal prison, my sister would lose everything she had. She begged me to be the bigger person and save the family. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like a worthless burden. I looked at the mother who had gladly conspired to steal my future to fund a lie. I gently but firmly pulled my hands out of her desperate grip. I leaned down, looking directly into her tear-filled eyes. I kept my voice incredibly calm. "I secure my own oxygen mask first, Mom." I told her I was not spending a single dime of my grandparents' hard-earned legacy to bail out a table full of thieves. I picked up my briefcase, preparing to walk away from the wreckage of their lives. But desperation makes people do incredibly foolish things. Connor realized that the briefcase in my hand held the original certified trust documents, the only real proof of my ownership and his crime. Out of options and out of his mind with panic, Connor did the unthinkable. He let out a desperate shout and lunged violently across the dining table, sending plates and silverware crashing to the floor as he tried to physically snatch the briefcase right out of my hands. He moved with the reckless speed of a man whose entire life was flashing before his eyes. But I had anticipated the panic. The moment his feet left the floor, I took a swift, calculated step backward. I pulled the heavy leather briefcase tightly against my chest. Connor completely missed his target. Instead of grabbing the documents, his outstretched hands caught the edge of the pristine white tablecloth. His momentum carried him forward, and he crashed violently into the center of the table. The massive 4-tier anniversary cake toppled over instantly. Huge arrangements of imported white roses and crystal vases shattered against the polished hardwood floor. The sound was deafening, like a bomb going off in the middle of the elegant ballroom. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Guests at the surrounding tables leaped out of their chairs, gasping and shouting as glass shards and spilled red wine splashed across their expensive shoes. Connor was a frantic mess. He was covered in white vanilla frosting and dirt from the floor, but he did not stop. He scrambled on his hands and knees, slipping on the slick frosting, still desperately trying to claw his way toward my ankles to get to the briefcase. He looked completely unhinged. Before he could even reach my shoes, 3 large country club security guards sprinted across the ballroom. They tackled him hard, driving his shoulder into the floor and pinning his arms behind his back. Connor thrashed and kicked, screaming that he needed those papers. My mother absolutely lost her mind. The sight of her wealthy son-in-law being manhandled by security guards completely shattered what was left of her high society composure. She ran forward, shrieking at the top of her lungs. She ordered the guards to take their hands off him immediately. When they refused to let him go, she turned her frantic energy toward the security manager. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. She hysterically claimed that I was insane. She lied through her teeth, screaming that I had attacked Connor unprovoked and that he was just trying to defend himself. She demanded that they throw me out of the building. The security manager did not even blink at her demands. He took one look at the absolute destruction of the VIP section, the terrified guests, and the grown man covered in cake fighting his guards. He calmly pulled his two-way radio from his belt and announced that he had already dispatched the Atlanta police and they were pulling up to the front entrance right now. The word police made my father snap into action. Calvin had spent decades building a reputation as a pillar of the community and a master negotiator. He puffed out his chest and marched over to the security manager. He lowered his voice, using his deep, authoritative tone, trying to command the situation. He name-dropped the country club president, the mayor, and 2 local judges. He threatened to have the entire security staff fired and their pensions revoked if they did not release Connor before the cops walked through the doors. He insisted this was an exclusive private event, and they were ruining a prominent family's celebration over a simple misunderstanding. His threats fell on deaf ears. The heavy wooden doors of the ballroom swung wide open, and 4 uniformed Atlanta police officers strode into the room. Their hands were resting cautiously on their duty belts as they surveyed the chaotic scene. Calvin instantly pivoted. He smoothed down his tuxedo jacket and approached the lead officer with an easy, practiced smile. He tried to play the role of the reasonable, wealthy patriarch. He chuckled lightly, telling the officer that it was just a minor family disagreement that got a little out of hand due to too much champagne. He promised he would cover all the damages to the venue and assured them that no police intervention was necessary. But Connor ruined his own rescue attempt. The security guards hauled him up from the floor. His velvet tuxedo was ripped at the seam and smeared with cake. Desperate, terrified, and realizing he was out of options, Connor yelled across the room to the police officers. He pointed at me and screamed that I was a corporate spy. He claimed I was a disgruntled former employee who had stolen highly sensitive financial documents from his real estate firm. He yelled that I was trying to extort the family for millions of dollars and that he was just trying to retrieve his stolen property. The lead officer turned his attention to me. He looked me up and down, taking in my calm demeanor, my pristine tailored suit, and the briefcase held securely in my hands. He asked me if I had anything to say about the accusations. I did not raise my voice. I did not act defensive or angry. I simply reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out my federal identification badge. I handed it to the officer and introduced myself, clearly stating my title as a senior forensic accountant for the federal government. The officer inspected the badge, his posture immediately shifting to a stance of professional respect. I told the officer that I had not stolen anything. I explained that I was the legal owner of a multi-million-dollar estate, and the man currently covered in cake had just committed federal wire fraud by forging my signature on a dead corporate title. Connor yelled that I was lying. I did not argue with him. I pulled my smartphone out of my pocket and unlocked the screen. I told the officer that I had audio evidence of exactly what transpired here tonight. I pressed play on the voice memo application and turned the volume all the way up. The audio echoed clearly in the sudden silence of the ballroom. It captured the exact moment from 20 minutes ago. The recording played Connor's voice admitting that he bypassed my ownership and secured the $1.5 million deposit. Then it played Jasmine's shrill voice, openly confessing that she had taken $300,000 of that stolen deposit yesterday morning to buy a luxury SUV and put a down payment on a penthouse condo just to keep up her fake social media lifestyle. The lead officer listened to the entire recording without saying a word. His expression hardened into solid stone. He handed my federal badge back to me with a nod. Then he turned his gaze slowly toward Connor and Jasmine. The color drained from Jasmine's face so completely she looked like a ghost. She clamped her hands over her mouth, realizing she had just confessed to grand larceny on a crystal-clear audio recording. My parents stood frozen, watching their entire empire, their flawless image of black excellence and their golden child's future evaporate into thin air. Mr. Pierce did not gasp or stumble. Men who build empires out of steel and concrete do not lose their composure over a sudden change in the weather. He simply extended his hand and took the certified federal documents from my grasp. The ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath as he flipped open the heavy manila folder. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket and spent a long, agonizing minute reading over the active tax identification numbers and the official federal seals. He traced the lines of text with his eyes, verifying that my blind trust was the absolute only legal owner of the estate. When he finished reading, he slowly lowered the papers and turned his attention back to my brother-in-law. The polite, friendly demeanor he had walked in with completely evaporated. It was replaced by a lethal corporate aggression that made the temperature in the room plummet. He stepped toward Connor, invading his personal space with the deliberate, terrifying confidence of an apex predator. Connor looked like a man standing on the gallows waiting for the floor to drop beneath his feet. He was shrinking backward, but his legs refused to move. Mr. Pierce did not raise his voice. He did not need to shout to establish his absolute dominance. His voice dropped into a low, freezing growl that cut right through the soft classical music still playing in the corner of the venue. I told Connor that he had exactly until 9 o'clock on Monday morning to wire every single cent of that $1.5 million deposit back into his corporate escrow account. He stated with absolute certainty that if the funds were not cleared and sitting in his bank by 1 minute past 9, he was going directly to his personal contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He leaned in closer, so only our table could hear the full weight of his promise. He told Connor that he would personally ensure he spent the rest of his pathetic life rotting in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny and wire fraud. He turned his chilling gaze toward my father, making it explicitly clear that Calvin was also in his crosshairs if this money was not returned. Mr. Pierce did not ask for an apology or an explanation. He turned on his heel and walked straight out of the Buckhead Country Club, leaving his expensive bottle of vintage champagne sitting untouched on our table. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind him with a resounding thud. The second he was out of earshot, the illusion of our perfect high society family completely imploded. The polished, sophisticated masks my parents had worn for decades melted away, revealing the vicious feral panic underneath. For my entire life, they had demanded my absolute loyalty, while giving me nothing but their cold disapproval in return. Now that their house of cards was collapsing, they reverted to their favorite defense mechanism, which was tearing me down. My mother, Vivian, turned on me with a wild, desperate look in her eyes. Her manicured hands were shaking with pure rage as she slammed her fists onto the table, causing the silverware to rattle against the fine china. She hit at me, demanding to know how I could be so cruel and heartless to my own blood. She accused me of deliberately orchestrating this entire setup to destroy the family name and ruin my sister's marriage, just because I was bitter and jealous of their beautiful life. She completely ignored the fact that they were the ones who had tried to steal from me. In her warped mind, I was the villain for simply refusing to be their victim. My father, Calvin, immediately joined the attack. His face turned a dark, furious shade of purple. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest and growled that I had just signed a death warrant for his luxury car dealerships. He yelled that a federal fraud scandal tied to his son-in-law would instantly ruin his credit with every major bank in Atlanta and destroy his business empire. They both stood over me, their voices rising in a frantic chorus of blame and condemnation. They called me a traitor, They said I was an ungrateful daughter who had just thrown her own family to the wolves. They tried to tell me that I owed them my silence and my compliance because they had put a roof over my head when I was a child. They tried to say that my actions tonight were a direct betrayal of our community standing, and that I was tearing down generations of hard work out of sheer spite. I sat there in my chair listening to them hurl every insult they could think of. I listened to them blame me for the devastating consequences of crimes they had actively committed. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear or offer a shred of defensive panic. I simply looked at my parents and calmly reminded them that I was not the one who forged a federal document. I was not the one who bypassed legal property laws and stole over $1 million. I told them they were looking at the wrong person if they wanted someone to blame for the impending destruction of their flawless country club reputation. I told them that their precious son-in-law was the one who had driven a stake through the heart of this family, and they were foolish for letting him do it. While my parents were busy attacking me, Connor was completely unraveling. He was pacing a tight, erratic circle behind his dining chair, gripping the sides of his head with both hands. The stark reality of federal prison was crashing down on him like a tidal wave, and pure primal self-preservation kicked into high gear. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He kept muttering about the authorities and the mandatory sentencing guidelines for wire fraud across state lines. He realized with absolute horror that his country club connections and his white privilege were not going to save him from a federal indictment. He looked at my parents, who were still screaming at me, and realized that their anger was not going to fix this. Blaming me might protect their fragile egos, but it would not put $1.5 million back into the developer's escrow account by Monday morning. Cornered, terrified, and realizing he was entirely out of options, Connor snapped. He stopped pacing and spun around to face his wife. The golden couple who had spent the entire evening looking down on everyone else completely fractured. Connor threw Jasmine directly under the bus with a velocity that shocked even me. He pointed a shaking finger at her and screamed at the top of his lungs that the forgery was entirely her idea. His voice cracked with panic as he yelled that he never wanted to pull the fake title, but Jasmine had practically begged him to forge my signature. He did not stop there. The floodgates opened, and every toxic secret they had been hiding poured out into the open for our parents and the surrounding tables to hear. Connor screamed that Jasmine was drowning in over $100,000 of hidden credit card debt. He exposed that her entire luxury influencer lifestyle was an absolute scam built on borrowed money and unpaid loans. He yelled that she had maxed out every line of credit they had just to buy designer bags and expensive vacations for her social media feed. He told the entire table that she had threatened to leave him and ruin his reputation if he did not find a massive influx of cash to fund her shopping addiction. Connor was sobbing now, his polished veneer totally destroyed. He yelled that he only forged the deed because she gave him no other choice, and that she was the one who pushed him into committing a federal crime to maintain her fake aesthetic. The truth hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, exposing the absolute rot beneath their perfect surface. He looked wildly between Jasmine and my parents, frantically trying to save his own skin by proving he was just a victim of her manipulation. The flawless high society image they had all murdered my peace of mind to protect was bleeding out right there on the dining room floor. But screaming at his wife was not going to wire $1.5 million into a federal escrow account by Monday morning. Connor knew that. As he stood there gasping for air, his wild eyes darted away from Jasmine and locked directly onto the leather briefcase resting on the table near my right hand. He realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that the briefcase held the original certified trust documents and the only tangible proof of my ownership. If he could just get his hands on that paperwork, he thought he could destroy the evidence and buy himself enough time to figure a way out of a federal indictment. He moved with the reckless, erratic speed of a man whose entire life was flashing before his eyes. He let out a desperate, guttural shout and lunged violently across the dining table, trying to physically snatch the briefcase right out of my hands. But I had spent my entire career anticipating the panicked reactions of cornered criminals. The moment his feet left the floor, I took a swift, calculated step backward and pulled the heavy leather briefcase tightly against my chest. Connor completely missed his target. Instead of grabbing the documents, His outstretched hands caught the edge of the pristine white tablecloth. His forward momentum carried him entirely off his feet. He crashed violently into the center of the table, sending plates, heavy silverware, and crystal wine glasses flying through the air. The massive four-tier anniversary cake, a custom vanilla and buttercream masterpiece decorated with edible gold leaf, was sitting right in his path. He collided face first into the towering dessert. The sound of the impact was deafening, like a bomb going off in the middle of the elegant ballroom. The heavy table collapsed under his weight, sending a chaotic wave of shattered crystal and spilled red wine splashing across the polished hardwood floor. The string quartet in the corner of the venue abruptly stopped playing mid-note. Guests at the surrounding VIP tables leaped out of their chairs, gasping and shouting as flying debris and frosting splattered against their expensive evening gowns and tailored suits. Connor was an absolute frantic mess. His custom velvet tuxedo jacket was ripped at the shoulder and completely smeared with white cake and crushed red roses. But the panic had completely overridden his sanity, and he did not stop fighting. He scrambled on his hands and knees, slipping and sliding on the slick frosting, still desperately trying to claw his way across the ruined floor toward my ankles to get to the briefcase. He looked completely unhinged, thrashing through the wreckage of my parents' perfect anniversary gala like a feral animal. Before he could even reach my shoes, the heavy thud of running footsteps echoed across the ballroom. 3 large country club security guards sprinted through the crowd. They descended on Connor, instantly tackling him hard and driving his shoulder into the floor to pin his arms behind his back. Connor thrashed and kicked against their grip, screaming wildly that he needed those papers and that I was trying to ruin his life. The sight of her wealthy white son-in-law being physically manhandled and restrained by security guards completely shattered what was left of my mother's high society composure. Vivian absolutely lost her mind. She ran forward through the spilled wine and broken glass, shrieking at the top of her lungs. She ordered the guards to take their hands off him immediately, screaming that they were making a terrible mistake. When the guards rightfully ignored her and kept Connor pinned to the floor, she turned her frantic energy toward the security manager, who had just jogged up to assess the situation. My mother pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my face and began to hysterically rewrite reality. She lied through her teeth, screaming that I was insane and that I was the one who had attacked Connor unprovoked. She wailed to the manager that her son-in-law was just trying to defend himself against my violent outburst and demanded that they throw me out of the building immediately. It was a staggering display of delusion. I stood there perfectly calm, not a single drop of cake or wine on my tailored suit, holding my briefcase securely, while the man she was defending was raving on the floor covered in frosting and struggling against 3 grown men. But that was Vivian. She was perfectly willing to look a room full of people in the eye and gaslight them into believing the black daughter she had always resented was the aggressor just to protect the white son-in-law who had elevated her country club status. The security manager did not even blink at her hysterical demands. He was a seasoned professional who had likely dealt with decades of entitled wealthy people throwing tantrums. He took one look at my absolute stillness, then surveyed the total destruction of the VIP section and the grown man thrashing on the floor. He calmly pulled his 2-way radio from his belt. He pressed the button and announced to his dispatch team that the situation had escalated to physical violence and property damage. He instructed them to bypass standard protocol and directly contact the Atlanta Police Department. The word police made my father snap out of his shocked silence. Calvin had spent his entire adult life building a reputation as a pillar of the Atlanta business community and a master negotiator who could talk his way out of any consequence. He puffed out his chest, smoothed down the lapels of his tuxedo jacket, and marched straight over to the security manager. He lowered his voice using his deep, authoritative tone, trying to completely command the narrative. He stepped into the manager's personal space and attempted to leverage every ounce of his social standing. He firmly stated that calling the authorities was a massive overreaction to a simple family disagreement that got a little out of hand due to high emotions and too much champagne. He promised he would pull out his checkbook right now and cover all the damages to the venue, including an extensive inconvenience fee for the staff. He aggressively name-dropped the country club president, the city mayor, and two local judges attempting to intimidate the manager into submission. He insisted this was an exclusive private event, and that they were ruining a prominent family's historic celebration over a trivial misunderstanding. He practically demanded that the guards let Connor up so we could handle our business privately, like respectable people. He warned the manager that bringing police cruisers to the front doors of the most elite country club in Buckhead would be a career-ending mistake. The security manager simply shook his head and took a step back, refusing to be bullied or bought. He looked my father directly in the eye and told him that once physical violence and significant property destruction occurred, it was no longer a private family matter. He pointed down at Connor, who was still weeping and struggling weakly against the guards restraining him. The manager stated with absolute finality that the police had already been dispatched and were pulling up to the front entrance right now. I watched the last remnants of my father's power drain away, leaving him looking incredibly old and profoundly weak. For my entire life, he had believed that his money and his status could shield him from accountability. He had taught my sister to believe the exact same thing. They had all operated under the assumption that they could steal my inheritance, forge my name, and destroy my future without ever facing a single consequence because they were simply too rich and too important to fail. But the real world does not care about your country club membership when you cross a federal line. I stood in the center of the wreckage, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace wash over me. The chaotic noise of the ballroom, the crying, the screaming, the shattered glass, all of it felt distant. I had not laid a single hand on anyone. I had not raised my voice. I had simply stood in my truth and presented the facts while my toxic family completely destroyed themselves trying to outrun their own lies. As the distant sound of police sirens began to echo through the grand windows of the ballroom, I tightened my grip on my briefcase and prepared to deliver the final absolute blow to their crumbling empire. The flashing blue and red lights of the patrol cruisers pierced through the sheer curtains of the country club windows, casting frantic shadows across the ruined ballroom. The heavy mahogany doors swung wide open, and four uniformed Atlanta police officers marched into the venue. Their hands rested cautiously on their duty belts as their eyes swept over the absolute chaos of the VIP section. They saw the overturned tables, the shattered crystal, the smeared wedding cake, and the 50 wealthy guests standing in stunned silence. My father, Calvin, immediately snapped into his role as the untouchable patriarch. He had spent decades building his reputation as a pillar of the Atlanta business community and a master manipulator who could charm his way out of any consequence. He smoothed down the lapels of his tuxedo jacket, completely ignoring the red wine splattered near his shoes, and approached the lead officer with an easy, practiced smile. I extended his hand, trying to project the image of a reasonable, wealthy man dealing with an unfortunate nuisance. He chuckled lightly, using his deep, resonant voice to tell the officer that everything was perfectly fine. He claimed it was just a minor family disagreement that got a little out of hand because emotions were running high and the champagne had been flowing too freely. He promised the officers that he would personally write a check right now to cover all the damages to the venue and assured them that absolutely no police intervention was necessary. He tried to politely usher them back toward the lobby, telling them they could go back to fighting real crime while we handled our private family business. But Connor ruined his own rescue attempt. The security guards hauled him up from the sticky floor. His custom velvet tuxedo was ripped at the shoulder and completely ruined by white vanilla frosting and crushed red roses. Desperate, terrified and realizing his father-in-law could not charm away a physical assault, Connor decided to play his final pathetic card. He yelled across the room to the police officers, pointing a shaking frosting-covered finger directly at me. He screamed that I was a corporate spy and a disgruntled former employee who had stolen highly sensitive financial documents from his commercial real estate firm. He yelled that I was trying to extort his family for millions of dollars and that he was just trying to retrieve his stolen property from my briefcase. He played the victim perfectly, begging the officers to arrest me for corporate espionage and theft. My mother, Vivian, immediately chimed in, nodding vigorously and wiping her fake tears. She told the officers that her son-in-law was telling the truth, and that I had always been the unstable, jealous sister trying to tear down my family. The lead officer turned his attention away from my father and walked over to me. He looked me up and down, taking in my completely calm demeanor, my pristine tailored suit, and the heavy leather briefcase held securely in my hands. He then looked back at Connor, who was panting and struggling against the security guards, looking like a complete maniac. The officer asked me if I had anything to say about these accusations of theft and extortion. I did not raise my voice. I did not act defensive or angry. I did not even look at my parents. I simply reached into my inner suit jacket pocket and pulled out my federal identification badge. I handed it to the lead officer and introduced myself clearly. I stated my full name and my official title as a senior forensic accountant for the federal government specializing in real estate compliance. The officer inspected the badge carefully. The moment he recognized the federal seal, his posture immediately shifted from suspicion to a stance of professional respect. He handed the badge back to me with a nod. I looked the officer in the eye and told him that I had not stolen a single piece of paper from anyone. I explained that I was the sole legal owner of a multi-million-dollar estate, and the man currently covered in cake across the room had just committed federal wire fraud by forging my signature on a dead corporate title to sell land he did not own. Connor yelled that I was a liar and that I was making everything up. He screamed that he had the legal right to sell the property and that I was just a crazy woman trying to ruin a legitimate business deal. I did not argue with him. I calmly reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen and told the lead officer that I did not expect him to just take my word for it. I explained that I had direct audio evidence of exactly what had transpired at this dinner table before the physical altercation began. I opened my voice memo application, pressed play, and turned the volume all the way up so the sound would carry across the quiet ballroom. The audio recording echoed perfectly in the tense silence of the country club. It captured the exact conversation from 20 minutes prior with absolute clarity. The recording played Connor's arrogant voice admitting that he bypassed my ownership and secured the $1.5 million deposit from the developer. Then the audio shifted to my sister Jasmine. Her shrill, panicked voice filled the room openly, confessing that she had taken $300,000 of that stolen deposit yesterday morning. Everyone in the room heard her admit to using the stolen funds to buy a brand new luxury sports utility vehicle and put a non-refundable down payment on a penthouse condo just to keep up her fake social media influencer lifestyle. The lead officer listened to the entire recording without saying a single word. When the audio finished playing, his expression hardened into solid stone. He turned his gaze slowly away from me and locked eyes with Connor and Jasmine. The color drained from Jasmine's face so completely she looked like she might pass out. She clamped both of her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute terror. She realized in that exact moment that she had just confessed to grand larceny and federal wire fraud on a crystal-clear audio recording, and she had done it right in front of the police. My parents stood frozen in place. Calvin dropped his charming smile and Vivian stopped her fake crying. They watched in sheer, unadulterated horror as their entire empire, their flawless image of black excellence, their country club status, and their golden child's future evaporated into thin air. The trap I set 15 years ago had finally snapped shut, and there was absolutely nothing their money or their social standing could do to save them now. The lead police officer did not ask any more questions. He had heard absolutely enough. He reached out and handed my phone back to me with a brief professional nod of acknowledgement. Then he turned his full attention to Connor. The officer signaled to his partner, and they moved in perfect unison toward the messy wreckage of the dining table. The country club security guards took a coordinated step back, allowing the local authorities to take complete control of the situation. The lead officer grabbed Connor's frosting-covered arm and firmly twisted it behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly through the ballroom. The sound was incredibly final and deeply satisfying. The officer began reading Connor his Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice that carried over the shocked whispers of the remaining guests. He told Connor he had the right to remain silent and that anything he said could and would be used against him in a court of law. Connor began to hyperventilate. His chest heaved as he cried and begged the officers to wait, claiming it was all just a terrible misunderstanding and that he could easily get the money back. His pleas were pathetic and completely useless. The officers ignored his sobbing and held him firmly in place. Seeing her husband in handcuffs completely broke whatever fragile grip Jasmine still had on reality. She let out a blood-curdling shriek and launched herself toward our father. She grabbed the lapels of Calvin's expensive tuxedo jacket, shaking him violently. She begged him to do something. She cried out for him to call his powerful political friends or write a massive check to bail Connor out. She demanded that he fix the situation right now before they took her husband away to a holding cell. But Calvin was completely paralyzed. The arrogant patriarch, who always had a solution and a wad of cash to make his problems disappear, was entirely out of options. His face was a sickly shade of gray, and his hands hung uselessly by his sides. He knew the absolute truth about his own finances. His luxury car dealerships were heavily mortgaged, and his business accounts were leveraged to the absolute limit just to support their extravagant daily lifestyle. He did not have $1.5 million in liquid cash sitting in a bank account. He could not write a check to save his son-in-law, because the check would bounce and send him to prison right alongside Connor. He stared blankly at Jasmine, unable to offer her a single word of comfort or a single dollar of rescue. Vivian was still on the floor, weeping into her hands. The entire room of elite Atlanta socialites was watching their spectacular downfall. The flawless image of prosperity and grace they had spent 40 years meticulously constructing was totally demolished in a matter of minutes. I stood there watching the chaos unfold, feeling an incredible sense of clarity. For my entire life, they had made me feel like I was the broken one. They had constantly told me I was not smart enough or successful enough to belong at their table. Now they were drowning in a desperate mess of their own making, and my hands were completely clean. Just as the police officers were preparing to march Connor out of the ballroom and into the back of a squad car, the heavy wooden doors of the venue swung open once again. 3 men dressed in immaculate dark suits walked into the room. They moved with a synchronized predatory confidence. They were carrying sleek leather briefcases, and their expressions were entirely void of any emotion. They did not look like party guests or country club members. They looked like corporate executioners. They were Mr. Pierce's high-powered legal team. The developer had not just walked out of the building to cool off. He had gone straight to his waiting luxury vehicle and immediately dispatched his lawyers to handle the situation with brutal efficiency. The lead attorney, a tall, sharp-featured man, approached the police officers. He introduced himself and politely requested a brief moment to speak with the family before the suspect was taken into federal custody. The lead police officer, recognizing the prominent law firm named by the attorney, nodded and took a cautious step back, keeping a firm grip on Connor's arm. The lawyer then turned his cold, calculating gaze toward my parents. He did not offer any pleasantries or warm introductions to Calvin and Vivian. He simply opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of complex legal documents. The lawyer spoke in a clear, carrying voice, ensuring that my parents understood the absolute gravity of the situation. He stated that Mr. Pierce was not a man who waited patiently for his money to be returned. He explained that Mr. Pierce knew the $1.5 million deposit had already been spent on luxury cars and real estate down payments based on the audio confession he just heard about. The lawyer made it clear that Mr. Pierce had no intention of waiting until Monday morning to see if Connor could magically produce the stolen funds. Instead, the legal team was here to offer my family one final brutal way out of a massive federal indictment. The terms were completely non-negotiable. The lawyer explained that Mr. Pierce was willing to drop the impending civil suits that would inevitably bankrupt my father's car dealerships and completely defund my mother's charity foundations. He was also willing to withhold the official corporate fraud report from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, preventing Connor from facing a mandatory federal prison sentence. But this unprecedented mercy came with an incredibly steep price. The lawyer held up the stack of papers and delivered the ultimatum. To cover the stolen funds and compensate for the massive breach of contract, Calvin and Vivian had to sign over the deed to their fully paid, pristine, multi-million-dollar suburban mansion right here and right now. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. The sprawling suburban estate was my mother's absolute pride and joy. It was a massive property situated in one of the most exclusive, highly sought-after neighborhoods in the city. It was the house where she hosted her elite book clubs and her high society charity dinners. It was the ultimate physical proof of their wealth and status. Because they had bought the home decades ago, it was the only major asset they owned outright that was not tied up in Calvin's messy business loans. Mr. Pierce and his legal team knew exactly what the property was worth, and they knew it was the only true leverage my parents had left. Calvin let out a strangled gasp. He shook his head frantically, telling the lawyer that taking their family home was an outrageous demand. He pleaded that the house was worth far more than the $1.5 million Connor had stolen. He begged for a few days to liquidate some business assets and secure a commercial loan to repay the debt. The lawyer did not even blink at his begging. He coldly reminded my father that they were no longer engaging in a standard real estate transaction. This was a strict restitution agreement to avoid a federal criminal conviction. The lawyer stated that the excess value of the home would be considered a penalty fee for the deliberate forgery and the immense waste of Mr. Pierce's valuable time. Vivian wailed loudly, clutching at her ruined designer gown. She cried out that they could not take her house because she had nowhere else to go. She looked at the lawyer with wide, desperate eyes, begging him to show some human compassion. The lawyer simply stared down at her and advised her that compassion was not included in his hourly billing rate. He laid the heavy legal documents flat on the only dining table in our section that had not been overturned during Connor's frantic attack. He pulled a silver pen from his pocket and placed it precisely next to the signature line. He looked directly at my father and delivered the final countdown. He told Calvin he had exactly 2 minutes to decide. He could either sign the property transfer right now and keep his son-in-law out of a federal penitentiary, or he could refuse and watch the police drag Connor out the front doors in handcuffs. The lawyer promised that if they chose to refuse, his firm would file the civil lawsuits first thing Monday morning, ensuring that every bank account and asset my parents possessed would be completely frozen by noon. They were entirely cornered. The trap was absolute, and there was no amount of charming manipulation or country club influence that could save them from the consequences of their own greed. The heavy silence following the lawyer's ultimatum was absolute. For the first time in my life, my parents had absolutely nothing to say. Calvin stood frozen, staring at the silver pen resting on the legal documents. His chest heaved as his brain desperately tried to calculate a way out of a trap that had no exit. The sprawling estate the lawyer was demanding was not just a house. It was the crown jewel of my parents' carefully curated black elite image. It was the venue for their high society galas, the backdrop for their magazine features, and the only tangible asset they owned, free and clear. To sign it over meant immediate, undeniable social death. Calvin turned his panicked eyes away from the lawyer and looked frantically toward his golden child. He looked at Jasmine, who was still clutching her ruined designer dress. He stepped toward her, his voice cracking with a desperate, pleading tone I had never heard him use before. He begged Jasmine to step up. He told her she had to call her bank right now and reverse the down payment on the penthouse condo. He pleaded with her to hand over the keys to the brand new luxury SUV she bought yesterday and to pawn every single diamond necklace and designer bag she owned. He told her if they liquidated everything she had just purchased with the stolen money, they could close the gap and satisfy the developer's demand without losing the family home. I watched Jasmine's face contort into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The suggestion that she should sacrifice her material possessions to save her own husband and her parents from ruin was completely incomprehensible to her. She physically recoiled from our father, backing away as if he had just asked her to cut off her own arm. She vehemently shook her head, her acrylic nails digging into her own skin. She screamed that she absolutely would not do it. She shrieked that she could not give up the condo or the car because she had already posted about them to her hundreds of thousands of social media followers. She cried that her entire brand was built on projecting wealth, and if she suddenly lost all her luxury items, she would be a laughingstock. She yelled that she refused to be homeless, and she absolutely refused to be embarrassed on the internet. Vivian gasped, reaching out a trembling hand toward her favorite daughter. She sobbed, asking Jasmine how she could be so selfish when her husband was literally standing 10 feet away in police handcuffs facing federal prison. Jasmine did not soften. She did not show a single ounce of empathy or loyalty. The spoiled, entitled monster. My parents had spent 32 years creating turned her viciousness directly onto her creators. Jasmine pointed a finger right in our mother's face. She screamed that this was all their fault to begin with. She yelled that Vivian and Calvin were the ones who put so much pressure on her to marry a rich white commercial broker to elevate the family status. She shrieked that they were the ones who taught her that appearances mattered more than anything else. Jasmine stomped her foot on the ruined floral carpet and demanded that our parents sign over their house immediately. She cried hysterically that they owed it to her. She said they had lived their lives and had their time in the spotlight, but her life as an influencer was just beginning. She yelled that if Connor went to federal prison, she would be tied to a convicted felon and her brand would be permanently destroyed. She demanded her parents sacrifice their lifelong home so she did not have to suffer the consequences of her own greed. The sheer audacity of her demands sucked the remaining air out of the room. I stood quietly near the police officers, watching the devastating realization finally wash over my parents' faces. It was a profound, crushing moment of clarity. Calvin and Vivian stared at Jasmine as if looking at a total stranger. The shiny, flawless illusion of their golden child completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, greedy parasite. They realized in that exact moment that they had spent my entire life breaking my back to pave the way for a daughter who would gladly throw them onto the street just to keep her luxury car. They realized they had sacrificed their only loyal, hardworking child, the one who had actually built a legitimate career and quietly protected them for years, just to appease a superficial brat who was selling them out in a heartbeat. Vivian let out a low, agonizing sob that sounded like it was being ripped straight from her soul. She covered her face with her hands, unable to look at Jasmine for a second longer. Calvin looked completely broken. His shoulders slumped and the authoritative posture he had maintained for decades completely collapsed. He looked like an old, defeated man who had just realized his entire life was a meaningless lie. The lead corporate lawyer checked his expensive wristwatch. He tapped his finger on the glass face and coldly announced that they had exactly 30 seconds left before he instructed the police officers to proceed with the arrest and transport the suspect to the federal holding facility downtown. Connor began to weep loudly from where the officers were holding him. He begged Calvin to sign the papers, crying out that he would pay them back someday and promising that he would make it right. It was the pathetic plea of a coward who had completely run out of leverage. Calvin slowly turned away from Jasmine. He did not look at me. He could not bring himself to meet my eyes because the shame was too absolute. He walked heavily toward the only cocktail table in our section that was not entirely shattered. The glass top was cracked and smeared with spilled wine, but it was still standing. The lawyer followed him, pulling the preliminary lien documents and the deed transfer paperwork from his folder. He laid the heavy stack of papers out on the cracked glass. He placed the silver pen right next to the signature line. Vivian stumbled over to the table, her ruined designer gown dragging heavily across the sticky floor. She leaned heavily against Calvin, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. With shaking hands, Calvin picked up the silver pen. He hovered over the document for a brief, agonizing second before pressing the ink to the page. I watched in absolute silence as my father signed away his kingdom. He signed away the sprawling mansion, the manicured lawns, the custom swimming pool, and the grand foyer where they hosted their elite country club friends. He signed away every ounce of financial security they had left in the world just to keep a criminal out of a jail cell. When he finished, he handed the pen to my mother. Vivian could barely see through her tears, but she gripped the pen and scrawled her signature next to his, sealing their total financial ruin. The lawyer swiftly collected the signed documents, checking the signatures with a clinical, precise eye. Satisfied, he nodded sharply to his team. He slipped the paperwork back into his sleek briefcase, snapping the locks shut with a definitive click. He turned to the lead police officer and smoothly stated that Mr. Pierce was officially declining to press charges for the theft and the forgery, as full restitution had just been legally secured. He added that the civil lawsuits would be dropped first thing Monday morning. The lead police officer looked at the lawyer with a tight jaw, clearly disgusted by the backroom corporate dealings, but bound by the law. Since the victim of the theft was officially refusing to cooperate with the prosecution and the stolen funds were legally compensated, the immediate grounds for arrest were severely complicated. The officer grabbed Connor by the arm and roughly unlocked the handcuffs, freeing his wrists. Connor rubbed his wrists, his chest heaving as he collapsed against a nearby pillar. He was no longer facing federal prison tonight. He was free to walk out of the country club. But the relief on his face was incredibly short-lived. Because while Mr. Pierce may have been satisfied, the state and federal regulatory boards operated under entirely different rules. And I was standing right there making sure every single detail was perfectly documented. The lead officer stepped right up to Connor. He told him that while the developer might be dropping the theft charges, the police department was still obligated to file an official incident report regarding the forged signature on a real estate deed. He stated with grim satisfaction that a copy of that police report would be forwarded directly to the State Commercial Real Estate Commission first thing in the morning. The lead police officer did not blink as he delivered the final piece of devastating news. He stood tall in his uniform, looking down at my brother-in-law with absolute professional detachment. He explained that while the wealthy developer might have been satisfied with stealing my parents' real estate to cover the missing funds, the police department operated under a completely different set of rules. The officer stated clearly that a forged property deed is a matter of public record the moment an incident report is generated. He informed Connor that the department was legally mandated to forward the detailed fraud report directly to the Georgia Real Estate Commission first thing Monday morning. Connor stopped rubbing his bruised wrists. The faint glimmer of relief that had just started to wash over his face vanished instantly, leaving him looking like a hollow shell. As a commercial broker, he knew exactly what the officer's words meant, and so did I. A formal police report detailing active forgery and grand larceny meant an immediate emergency suspension of his commercial real estate license. That suspension would swiftly be followed by a permanent revocation by the state board. His career was instantly and permanently dead. He would never legally broker a single square foot of property in the state of Georgia or anywhere else in the country ever again. His entire identity as a high-rolling country club real estate mogul was completely wiped out with a single sentence. I stood silently watching the gears turning frantically in his head. The immediate threat of a federal prison cell was gone, but it was instantly replaced by the terrifying reality of total financial ruin. Connor had no license. He had no firm. He had no future income, and his professional reputation was utterly destroyed in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta. But worse than all of that, he was legally married to a woman who had just confessed on a crystal-clear audio recording to accumulating over $100,000 in hidden credit card debt. He remembered that my sister Jasmine had just admitted to the police that she stole $300,000 of the deposit to buy a luxury sports utility vehicle and a penthouse condo she could no longer afford. He realized he was legally tethered to a sinking ship of massive liabilities. Connor slowly turned his head to look at my sister. Jasmine was still standing near the shattered remains of the dining table, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Her expensive designer gown was ruined, and her makeup was completely smeared across her face. She reached a trembling hand out toward him, expecting a hug or a word of profound gratitude, now that he was not being hauled off to a federal penitentiary. She looked at him with wide, desperate eyes, expecting him to thank her parents for sacrificing their lifelong home to save his skin. She thought they had survived the worst of the storm together. Connor did not reach back to hold her hand. He looked at the woman he had vowed to love and cherish with a gaze so incredibly cold and empty, it made the hairs on my arms stand up. He did not yell this time. He did not scream or point fingers or throw a violent tantrum like he had just minutes ago. The sheer panic had left his body replaced entirely by the cold, calculating instinct of pure self-preservation. He simply adjusted his torn and frosting-covered velvet tuxedo jacket and delivered the final fatal blow to their marriage. He looked down at Jasmine and told her she was completely out of her mind if she thought he was going down with her. He stated in a flat, emotionless voice, that he was contacting his attorney the very second the law offices opened tomorrow morning. He told her he was filing for divorce immediately to legally shield whatever personal assets he had left from her massive mountain of debt. He looked at her not with love, but with absolute disgust. He said she was a financial parasite who had manipulated him into committing a federal crime just to fund her fake internet lifestyle. He told her he was cutting his losses right here and leaving her to drown in the debt she created. Jasmine froze, completely paralyzed by the sheer brutality of his words. The declaration hit her harder than a physical strike. She looked at Connor and then slowly turned her head to look at our parents. Calvin and Vivian were still standing near the developer's corporate lawyer, completely ruined and stripped of all their wealth. Jasmine had literally just forced our mother and father to sign away their multi-million-dollar suburban mansion to keep her husband out of handcuffs. She had demanded that her parents give up their financial security and their only tangible asset to protect her marriage and her social status. She had sacrificed the only two people in the world who unconditionally supported and enabled her. And she had done it all to save a man who dropped her the absolute second she was no longer profitable to him. The realization of what she had done and what she had lost crashed over Jasmine all at once. A low, agonizing wail ripped from her throat. It was not her usual manipulative crying or her performative victim routine. It was the raw, devastating sound of a woman realizing her entire life was a lie, and she had absolutely no one left to blame but herself. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the sticky, ruined floor of the ballroom. She sobbed uncontrollably, digging her acrylic nails into her hair and rocking back and forth in the wreckage of the anniversary party. She begged Connor not to leave her, crying out that she did it all for them and that she gave up her parents' house just to save his life. She pleaded with him to stay, telling him they could figure it out and start over. Connor did not even blink at her tears. He did not offer her a single ounce of comfort or pity. He just turned his back on his sobbing wife, stepped over the shattered crystal on the floor, and walked toward the exit of the ballroom without a single shred of remorse. I watched him walk away, leaving my sister weeping on the floor. Jasmine had spent 32 years believing that her beauty and her superficial charm entitled her to everything she wanted. She had treated me like garbage our entire lives because she believed her proximity to whiteness and wealth made her superior. Now she was sitting in a puddle of spilled wine and cake frosting, completely abandoned by the man she thought elevated her status. She had no money, no luxury cars, no penthouse condo, and no husband. She had traded her family's entire legacy for an illusion, and now she was left holding absolutely nothing. My father, Calvin, watched Connor walk out the doors, his face a mask of pure devastation. He looked at Jasmine crying on the floor and finally understood the catastrophic mistake he had made. He had spent my entire life breaking my back to pave the way for a golden child who had just destroyed his entire world for a man who did not even love her. Calvin and Vivian had sacrificed their only loyal, hardworking daughter to appease a superficial brat, and now they were left with a broken family and zero assets. The silence in the ballroom was heavy, broken only by Jasmine's pathetic sobbing and the distant hum of the police radios. The trap had sprung, the consequences had been delivered, and the entire foundation of their toxic lives had been permanently leveled. Jasmine remained crumpled on the sticky floral carpet of the ballroom, staring at the heavy mahogany doors that had just swung shut behind her husband. Her custom silk designer gown was completely saturated with spilled red wine and smashed vanilla buttercream, but she did not even try to stand up. She simply sat in the wreckage of the dining table, clutching her knees to her chest. The harsh reality of her situation was settling over her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. She had spent her entire adult life curating a flawless influencer aesthetic built entirely on borrowed money and fake prestige. She had demanded that our parents sacrifice their lifelong home, their sanctuary, and their only true financial safety net, just to save a man who discarded her the second she became a liability. She was totally alone, bankrupt, and publicly disgraced in front of the most elite social circle in Atlanta. My father, Calvin, watched the doors close with a blank, hollow stare. The imposing, powerful patriarch who had spent 40 years bullying his way through the local business community was completely gone. His broad shoulders sagged under the crushing weight of his own greed. He had literally just signed away the multi-million-dollar suburban estate he had worked his entire life to pay off. He had surrendered his greatest asset to a ruthless developer to protect a son-in-law who walked out on his family less than 2 minutes later. Calvin looked down at his trembling hands, the same hands that had just forged the instrument of his own destruction. He could not find the words to speak. He could not even summon the energy to yell. He simply turned away from the wreckage and stared blankly at the wall. A broken, defeated man who had traded his only loyal daughter for a temporary illusion of power. The lead police officer instructed the remaining country club security guards to secure the area and handle the property damage reports. The officers turned and exited the venue, their heavy-duty boots crunching loudly over the broken crystals scattered across the floor. The flashing red and blue lights faded from the sheer curtains, leaving the ballroom bathed in the harsh, unforgiving glow of the overhead chandeliers. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy, broken only by the sound of Jasmine quietly sobbing on the floor. The surrounding guests, the wealthy politicians, local celebrities and high society friends my parents had invited to witness their greatness were already stepping away. They were gathering their expensive coats and whispering frantically among themselves. Cell phones were out, and text messages were flying across the city. In the elite social circles of Atlanta, reputation was the absolute ultimate currency, and my parents' account was permanently overdrawn. Everyone in that room knew they had attempted to steal from their own flesh and blood. Everyone knew they were losing their mansion to a federal fraud settlement. By tomorrow morning, my parents would be entirely ostracized from the very community they had sacrificed my mental health to impress. The country club general manager stepped forward through the thinning crowd. He held a thick clipboard in his hand, and his face was a mask of furious professional contempt. He stopped a few feet away from my parents and cleared his throat, demanding their immediate attention. He informed them that the massive property damage, the shattered tables, the ruined carpet, and the massive disruption to the venue would be fully assessed and billed directly to their accounts by morning. He coldly suggested they gather their remaining belongings and vacate the premises immediately. That was the exact moment the devastating reality of impending homelessness finally hit my mother. Vivian began to tremble violently. The adrenaline of the confrontation had completely drained from her body, leaving her looking frail and incredibly old. She looked around the ruined ballroom, taking in the disgusted glares of her former friends and the shattered remains of her 40th anniversary gala. By Monday morning, she would have absolutely nothing. No sprawling foyer to host her elite charity dinners. No manicured lawns to show off to her neighbors. Her credit cards would inevitably be frozen by the impending civil suits from my father's collapsing car dealerships. She did not even have the cash to pay the furious country club manager standing in front of her. She turned her head slowly and looked at me. I was standing near the edge of the ruined dining area, my leather briefcase held securely at my side. My tailored suit was completely spotless. I was the only person in our entire family who had survived the night fully intact. I had not screamed or thrown a tantrum. I had simply presented the facts and watched them destroy themselves. Vivian took a shaky, hesitant step toward me. She stumbled over a broken chair leg, her designer heels slipping on the ruined frosting. She looked absolutely pathetic. The arrogant, demanding matriarch who had spent my entire life treating me like a disposable burden was completely stripped of all her pride. She stopped just a few feet away from me, wrapping her arms around her own waist as if she were trying to hold her shattered pieces together. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. It was the exact same manipulative expression she had used for decades to guilt-trip me into cleaning up their financial messes. But this time there was genuine terror behind her tears. Her voice cracked, barely rising above a pathetic, trembling whisper. She told me that she and my father had absolutely nowhere to go. She sobbed that the developer's corporate lawyers were going to lock them out of their beloved home by the end of the week. She reached a shaking hand out toward me, though she did not dare touch my suit. She asked me, her voice breaking into a ragged whimper, if she and Calvin could move into my grandparents' estate. She begged me to let them stay in the historic home she had spent the entire evening trying to steal from me. She promised they would not be a bother. She swore it would just be a temporary arrangement until my father could secure a new business loan and they could get back on their feet. She cried that they were my parents and that I could not possibly let them live on the street. The sheer profound audacity of her request was staggering. I looked at the wreckage of the family I had spent 35 years craving approval from. I looked at my sister, still sobbing on the floor over a man who had used her as a financial shield. I looked at my father, who was too ashamed to even turn around and face me. And then I looked at my mother, who still genuinely believed that after decades of emotional abuse and a coordinated attempt to commit federal fraud, she could simply ask me to save her from the consequences of her own actions. She was asking to live on the very land my grandparents had purchased during segregation, the land they had sweated and bled for, the land she had openly mocked as a useless dirt patch until she needed to steal it to fund a lie. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel sad or betrayed. I felt entirely and beautifully free. The heavy generational chains of obligation and guilt completely fell away from my shoulders. I reached into my purse. My fingers brushed past my federal identification badge and closed around a piece of thick folded paper. I pulled out the heavy leather folder containing the original $15,000 catering bill from the very beginning of the night. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I placed the leather folder on the only remaining dry spot of the cracked glass cocktail table. I slid it across the surface until it stopped right in front of my mother's trembling hands. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice completely calm, steady, and carrying absolute finality. "Like you said, Mom," I told her, making sure she heard every single syllable clearly over the sounds of my crying sister. "That property is strictly for people who contribute to the legacy. Pay your bill." I did not wait for her response. I did not need to hear another excuse or another desperate plea. I turned my back on her completely. I walked past the ruined cake, past the shattered glass, and past the shocked country club guests who were watching in absolute silence. The crisp sound of my heels echoed across the hardwood floor. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom and stepped out into the cool Atlanta night air, leaving my parents and my sister weeping in the ruins of their anniversary party. Walking out of the Buckhead Country Club that night was like taking my first real breath of air in 35 years. The cool Atlanta breeze felt clean and sharp against my face. I did not look back at the grand mahogany doors. I did not wait by my car to see if anyone would run after me with a sudden miraculous apology. I knew exactly who they were, and I was finally entirely at peace with walking away from them. 6 months have passed since that anniversary gala. 6 months since the flawless illusion of my family's elite status completely imploded on the ballroom floor. The fallout was not just a private family tragedy. It was a massive, highly publicized spectacle that ripped through Atlanta high society like a hurricane. When you build your entire empire on arrogance and lies, the collapse is always going to be deafening. Connor learned that lesson the hardest way possible. Signing over my parents' mansion kept him out of handcuffs that specific night, but it did absolutely nothing to stop the federal government. The State Commercial Real Estate Commission received the police report on Monday morning, just as the officer promised. They revoked his broker's license before lunch. But the real blow came 3 weeks later. The federal authorities had subpoenaed the audio recording I captured. They did not care that the developer was satisfied with his new real estate. They cared about the blatant wire fraud and the forgery of federal documents. Connor was formally indicted. His boutique commercial real estate firm was shuttered permanently. The sleek downtown office he used to brag about was cleared out and locked tight. Now, instead of wearing velvet tuxedo jackets and sipping vintage champagne, he wears cheap suits to federal court hearings, desperately trying to negotiate a plea deal that might keep him out of a minimum security prison. His promise to divorce Jasmine was the only thing he actually followed through on. He filed the paperwork the very next morning, legally severing himself from her massive liabilities. Jasmine's spectacular downfall was almost difficult to watch, but it was entirely of her own making. The golden child who had spent her whole life looking down her nose at me was suddenly left holding the bag for over $100,000 in hidden credit card debt. The bank was absolutely merciless. The brand new luxury sports utility vehicle she bought with the stolen deposit was repossessed right out of the country club parking lot a few days later. The penthouse condo she put a down payment on canceled her contract and kept the cash. But the financial ruin was not even the worst part for my sister. The worst part was the social annihilation. In Atlanta, secrets do not stay secret for long. The story of the forged deed, the stolen money, and the country club meltdown leaked to the local blogs within 48 hours. It spread across social media like wildfire. Jasmine's carefully curated luxury influencer aesthetic was instantly exposed as a total fraud. Brands dropped her sponsorships immediately. Her comment sections were flooded with people mocking her fake wealth and calling her out for stealing from her own sister. The humiliation was so absolute and so deeply public that she permanently deleted all of her social media accounts just to stop the relentless ridicule. Today, the woman who used to demand front row seats at fashion shows is working a minimum wage retail job at a mid-tier shopping mall. She spends her days folding the exact same designer clothes she used to pretend she could afford, standing on her feet for 8 hours a day, and dealing with difficult customers. She has no money, no husband, and no platform. She traded her soul for an illusion and ended up with absolutely nothing. My parents did not fare any better. Calvin and Vivian had to pack up 40 years of memories and walk out of their multi-million-dollar suburban mansion. Mr. Pierce's corporate lawyers did not give them an inch of grace. They executed the property transfer with brutal efficiency. The loss of the house was just the first domino to fall. Once the rumors of the fraud scandal hit the business community, Calvin's luxury car dealerships went into a total tailspin. His silent partners pulled their investments. The major banks called in his heavily leveraged business loans and refused to extend his lines of credit. He was forced to liquidate his remaining assets just to avoid a total corporate bankruptcy. The social exile was absolute. Vivian's elite charity boards politely asked her to step down effectively immediately. The country club quietly revoked their membership, claiming that the extensive property damage and police presence at the anniversary gala violated their strict code of conduct. The friends they had spent decades trying to impress completely abandoned them, refusing to return their phone calls or invite them to social gatherings. My parents are now living in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the far outskirts of the city. The space is too small for the heavy ornate furniture they managed to salvage from the mansion. They are completely isolated, cut off from the wealth and prestige that used to define their entire existence. I heard through the grapevine that they rarely leave the apartment because the shame of running into their former high society peers is just too much to bear. They sacrificed their only loyal daughter to protect their image, and in the end they lost the daughter, the image, and the wealth all at once. While their world crumbled, my world expanded in ways I had only ever dreamed of. I am no longer just a forensic accountant managing other people's compliance records. I stand today on the wide wrap-around balcony of my grandparents' historic estate. The sprawling green property stretches out before me, bathed in the warm afternoon sun. I did not sell a single inch of it. Instead, I used my own savings and secured legitimate commercial grants to develop the land exactly the way my grandparents would have wanted. The sound of construction equipment echoes across the property. We broke ground last month on a massive new project. I am transforming this historic plot of land into a state-of-the-art technology and finance incubator specifically designed for minority women. We are building a massive facility with collaborative workspaces, mentorship offices, and resource centers. I am creating a space where brilliant Black women who have been overlooked, underestimated, and told to sit at the overflow tables of life can come to build their own empires. I am making sure they have the financial backing, the legal guidance, and the community support they need to succeed without ever having to compromise their integrity or beg for a seat at someone else's table. I lean against the balcony railing, taking a deep breath of the fresh air. I am not alone up here. I hear the sound of genuine laughter coming from the open French doors behind me. I am surrounded by my chosen family. I have incredible colleagues who respect my brilliance and value my leadership. I have loyal friends who love me for exactly who I am, not for what I can buy them or how I make them look in public. And I have a partner standing beside me, holding my hand. Someone who celebrates my independence and encourages my ambition every single day. I look out over the construction site, watching the foundation of the new incubator being poured into the earth. I feel a profound sense of pride swelling in my chest. I kept the land safe. I protected my grandparents' legacy, and I turned it into a beacon of hope and prosperity for the future. The toxic weight of my family's expectations is gone forever, replaced by a bright, limitless horizon. Looking out at the construction site, I realize that building an empire requires clearing away the debris of the past. For 35 years, I allowed my parents and my sister to define my worth. I let them convince me that because I did not wear designer clothes or care about country club memberships, I was somehow less valuable. I swallowed their insults and accepted my place at the overflow tables of life just to keep the peace. But peace built on your own subjugation is not peace at all. It is just quiet misery. I step back inside the estate and join my colleagues and friends. We share a toast with inexpensive sparkling cider in plastic cups because we are too busy working to care about crystal glasses. It is the exact opposite of the extravagant anniversary gala where my family destroyed themselves. But this room is filled with more genuine love and authentic excellence than my parents ever experienced in their entire lives. Healing from a lifetime of emotional neglect does not happen overnight. There were nights during these past 6 months where I sat in my quiet apartment and felt a profound sense of grief. I grieved for the family I should have had. I grieved for the parents who should have protected me instead of trying to exploit me. I mourned the sister who could have been my best friend if she had not been poisoned by greed and entitlement. But every time that sadness threatened to pull me under, I looked at the framed copy of that $15,000 catering bill hanging on my office wall. It serves as a daily reminder of exactly what I walked away from and exactly why I can never go back. My mother and father spent decades chasing a flawless image of Black excellence. They wanted the world to look at them and see absolute perfection. They bought the biggest houses, drove the most expensive cars, and threw the most lavish parties. But they fundamentally misunderstood what true legacy actually means. True wealth is not determined by the zip code you live in, the cars you drive, or the labels stitched inside your clothes. True wealth is determined by the integrity you keep when the doors are closed and nobody is watching. It is measured by how you treat the people who depend on you and how fiercely you protect the things that truly matter. They chose to worship an illusion. They chose a white son-in-law who looked good on paper over a black daughter who actually had their backs. They were so terrified of losing their social status that they eagerly participated in their own destruction. They let their greed blind them to the trap I set, and when the walls closed in, they turned on each other like starving animals. I did not have to lift a single finger to ruin them. I just had to step out of their way and let them face the severe consequences of their own toxic choices. Sometimes the hardest thing a person can do is accept that the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you actually need protection from. I had to mourn the parents and the sister I deserved so I could finally free myself from the family I actually got. I had to let them completely destroy themselves so I could finally build my own empire from the ground up. Now, when I look at the future, I do not see the heavy burden of their expectations. I see generations of brilliant, driven minority women walking through the doors of this incubator. I see them securing their own funding, building their own businesses, and learning how to protect their assets from anyone who tries to take advantage of them. That is the real legacy my grandparents wanted for this land. They did not buy this property during a time of immense racial struggle just so my parents could use it as a bargaining chip to pay off secret gambling debts. They bought it so it could be a foundation for generational empowerment. And I am making absolutely sure that their original vision becomes a reality. I want to speak directly to anyone listening to this story who is currently sitting at an overflow table. I want to talk to the people who are constantly overlooked, underestimated, and treated like an afterthought by their own blood relatives. You do not have to set yourself on fire just to keep your toxic family warm. Blood does not make a family. Respect, loyalty, and unconditional support make a family. Do not ever let anyone convince you that you have to tolerate abuse, disrespect, or financial exploitation just because you share a last name. You hold the pen to your own life story. You have the power to draw a firm line in the sand and walk away from tables where you are no longer valued. It can be terrifying to step out on your own and leave behind everything you know, But the freedom on the other side of that fear is worth every single tear. You have to be willing to lose toxic people in order to find yourself. Protect your assets. Keep your plans quiet. Know your incredible worth. And never let anyone sell your future behind your back. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace and secure your own legacy? Have you ever walked away from people who tried to dim your light just so they could shine brighter? I want to hear your stories. Let me know in the comments below. Share your experiences so others know they are not alone in their journey to freedom. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that the best revenge is always building a beautiful, successful life completely without them. The waiter returned at that exact moment and placed the printed credit card receipt in front of me. I picked up a heavy silver pen, signed my name with a smooth, deliberate flourish, and pushed the leather folder back across the table toward my mother. Then I shifted my gaze back to Ethan, who had suddenly stopped smiling entirely. His hand tightened around his bourbon glass, and his breathing hitched. "That is fascinating, Ethan," I said, my voice slicing through the soft classical music playing in the background of the ballroom, "because the title you forged and sold yesterday afternoon expired 15 years ago."